Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of Roots Tech, and welcome to DNA and Endogamy, Strategies to Analyze Your DNA Matches. I'm Dr. Adina Newman, sometimes known as My Family Genie if you follow me at all on social media, and I'm delighted to speak on this topic today because this is the topic I personally deal with for my own genealogy and for that in my professional capacity on a regular basis. Something you'll learn about my talks is it's really based on practice. I spend lots and lots of time working through people's DNA matches, commonly dealing with endogamous populations because I am a professional genetic genealogist and my specialties include Ashkenazi Jewish DNA, and I'll talk more about all of that as we go through the presentation. Just some housekeeping. Please silence all your electronic devices. Please no audio or video recording and no photos. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, so I like to start this talk by saying how DNA is not a silver bullet, which is disappointing to a lot of people who are very into DNA, but it has to be said. You may have heard people quip, DNA doesn't lie. I see that all the time. DNA doesn't lie, but you have to remember DNA is just another tool in our genealogical toolbox. It is not a substitute for a family tree. So you can't just forget the whole family tree part and start with your DNA. It is necessary to build trees for making sense of your DNA results, even when your DNA results and family trees seem to be in conflict. And that's often what happens as a genetic genealogist is something that we have on paper may be tested by the DNA results. But when we're talking about trees, and this is for all populations, especially with endogamy, you need trees, even more so, because you have to understand the inheritance patterns and how you're potentially sharing with all the people that you have matches with. So, mostly today when I'm talking about endogamy, we're talking about the autosomal DNA test. That's going to be my focal point, because these are the most useful for finding your DNA relatives. And we're only going to talk about those commercial DNA testing sites like Ancestry and 23andMe, Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about GEDmatch as well, because that is a tool we use dealing with endogamous populations. So if you are not familiar with endogamy, this is a visual representation that I like to share. All right? So I tend to use the definition from the International Society of Genetic Genealogy that endogamy is the practice of marrying within the same ethnic, cultural, social, religious, or tribal group. In endogamous populations, everyone's going to descend from that same small gene pool. So that founder population is a very important aspect of endogamy, and it makes your DNA, your tree, look like a tumbleweed. All right? So let's talk about some endogamous communities, because there are lots of them. Ashkenazi Jewish, which is what I deal with every day. Acadian, that is an endogamous population. Cajun, French Canadian, like Quebecois, but it depends kind of on the area as well. Amish, Mennonite communities, Native American, Polynesian, colonial endogamy you may have heard of. Arab populations, islands and villages, rural communities. If you have any of these in your tree, you're likely dealing with endogamy, and there's a reason why there's a lot of people here today, because I think a lot of you probably recognize that there's endogamy in your tree and in your DNA matches. So, of course, what are the implications of endogamy? Why does it matter? First thing I want to say that endogamy varies across populations. There is, I think, kind of in the community when people talk about endogamy, they mean a lot of different things, but it looks different for different people. However, you may notice with your endogamy that you have thousands of matches, much more compared to others. I, on Ancestry, have 200,000 matches. Yeah, there's shocks in the crowd, shock in the crowd. Most of those matches, though, are comprised of really teeny tiny segments that make you look like you're closer to matches than you actually are because you may be related to them in multiple ways. Also, all your matches seem to share DNA with each other, so when you're trying to sort by parent or something like that, it doesn't work well. And if you're into the Leeds method or auto-clustering programs, they don't work or they don't work well. So you might notice this, or if you are noticing this and you weren't sure if you're dealing with endogamy, this is a clear sign that you are. I also want to say when we're talking about endogamy across populations, I consider it a continuum. So something like colonial endogamy, I would say low, okay? It's not as prevalent in your matches. It's not going to affect it in the same way as, say, Polynesian. I remember the first time I saw some Polynesian DNA results on Ancestry, something like 1,000 centimorgan match, totally endogamous. Okay, so different levels here. What I deal with, Ashkenazi Jewish, probably more on the moderate to high, but again, it's a continuum. So it doesn't look the same for every endogamous population because it depends on the founder population, how many people you descend from, how many generations this has been going on, okay? And how much kind of genetic diversity entered the pool as well. So that's why you'll see some differences maybe across populations. Just so you get a sense of auto-clustering at Genetic Affairs, this is my lovely cluster. If anyone can make sense of this, please talk to me after, but this is what it's going to look like when you're dealing with endogamy. So, I didn't touch anything. This is just the default on Genetic Affairs. So, very useful, right? Right. So, this is why most of you are probably all here, because you want some strategies to mitigate the effects of endogamy. Build your trees and build them again. That is the first thing I'm going to say to you. And when I talk about building trees, not just up and down, you have to build laterally as well. You got to build out those branches. It's really, really important to do that. You're going to focus on your highest matches, which I think often that's what most people are doing, but you have to look at the large segment matches. So that segment data is very, very important when you're dealing with endogamy. And when I talk about large segments, again, it can vary across populations, but I try to look at matches with at least a 20 to 30 centimorgan longest segment. I want longer, typically, and you also want a couple others that are 10 to 20 or more, okay? Because sometimes we'll get these great matches, and they'll be like a 30 centimorgan longest segment, but everything else is tiny. So that might affect why you're not able to find things. You also, some of the sites allow you to resort your matches by longest segment or number of segments, and then you can go to the last page, because if we have a match, the less segments for 100, and I'll talk more about this later, I'll show you an example. If we have a 100 centimorgan match, it makes a difference how many segments across for those 100 centimorgans. You're also going to look at that total centimorgans number of segments ratio if you don't have a chromosome browser, for example, right? So something like Ancestry, they'll tell you the number of segments, and you'll know the total so you can figure it out. And of course, use that chromosome browser when available, and target test known family members. I can't stress this enough. We really need you to test people because it helps you sort people into the correct buckets, okay? And of course, I love painting DNA, and I find it to be very, very helpful when I'm dealing with my endogamous community. All right, so some of you may be familiar with the Speed and Balding study from 2014, and if not, there's a great entry for it on the International Society of Genetic Genealogy wiki. But basically, we know kind of, theoretically speaking, and it's not perfect, but we have a sense of how long a segment can kind of last over the generations. So what this study found is that 40% of 20 megabase pairs, it's kind of tantamount to a centimorgan, think of it that way. 40% of 20 megabase segments date back over 10 generations. Think about that. If you have a 20 cm match, or 20 cm longest segment, that segment could be from your 9th, 10th, 11th great-grandparent. I know my tree does not go back that far. Some trees do, but it could be very hard to trace that. A 25 megabase segment will originate within 5 generations, 35% of the time, but can date back over 20 generations, nearly 20% of the time. So segments can, they don't have to break up, very quickly. We look at large segments, which is why I kind of focus on 30 centimorgans or more now. But again, This is just some probability. This is theoretical. There have been some genetic genealogists who have said that this is kind of too much and it's not that bad, but it gives you a sense of, if you know all the tricks for dealing with endogamy and you knew about longest segments, but you've been focusing those longest 20 and you're not finding anything, this could be why. Okay, here's one I hear all the time. Because of endogamy, it's impossible to find family. So I'll get this is kind of what I hear. So I'm Ashkenazi Jewish and share 1,000 centimorgans with this person, but it's probably a generation more distant. Or I share 400 centimorgans with someone, but it must be because of endogamy. I couldn't possibly relate to them. Okay? I hear this all the time in lots of endogamous communities because it's kind of a defeatist attitude, or maybe they don't recognize the match. But it's really important to understand the population you're working with. So with Ashkenazi Jews, endogamy really doesn't become problematic unless more distant than second cousin range. So if you're having a 400 centimorgan match, that means something. And I'm not just going to assume because I have 1,000, I need to bump it another level to another relationship, another generation. That's not how it works. Populations like Acadians are very similar to that, right? I'm not going to just make these assumptions. But again, it depends on the population, but this is kind of, second cousin range it does a very good job on. And sometimes endogamy is confused with pedigree collapse. I often hear that people say I have endogamy in my tree, but they really mean pedigree collapse. So when I think about endogamy, and everybody has a different way of talking about this, I think of endogamy more in terms of the population. Like the population you're dealing with is endogamous, whether it's that rural community or Amish or Mennonite, whatever it is. Pedigree collapse is something that's in the family, and I sometimes call it the chicken or the egg problem, which comes first, the pedigree collapse or the endogamy. But I'm from an endogamous population, but for example, my great-grandparents are first cousins. So there's pedigree collapse right there. So it's going to affect my more recent matches. But I have, colleagues in an endogamous community that have no recent pedigree collapse in their tree. Okay, so it affects DNA in different ways. And tools like the Shared Centimorgan Project and the DNA Detectives Green Chart, they typically still apply for those second cousin and closer matches, even sometimes third cousin. So this is that green chart people still sometimes talk about. It's kind of out of date, but I like it kind of as a quick reference when I'm trying to figure out where somebody belongs. You can just kind of look in the DNA Detectives Facebook group. I think you can also find it online as well. But it gives you a sense of where you belong, and really anything around that Group E level, I feel pretty good about. I mean, more the higher end of Group E, that doesn't really get affected by endogamy so much. And then, of course, the Shared Centimorgan Project. I know it says in the Shared Centimorgan Project that they don't account for endogamy, and it's true. But something like a 435 centimorgan match for most endogamous populations, maybe barring Polynesian, I'm still going to be looking at it. I'm not going to assume that I have to kick it a generation back. I'm still looking at the probabilities here. And I say this just from practice and seeing thousands of, at this point, DNA results of people and what they look like with their relatives. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to go through each of the sites and talk about kind of tips for dealing with endogamy in them. So at this point, Ancestry has the largest database of 25 million plus. And I tend to recommend people, even dealing with endogamous populations, test here first to find family. And they don't have a chromosome browser, which we'll talk about why that can be problematic, but they seem to do a really good job overall of sifting through endogamous matches and kind of just how their algorithm works. So matches that tend to be around 150 centimorgans up tend to be, I would say, for what I do, kosher, right? They tend to be what they're supposed to be. Not always, but they tend to work well. But I would say you need to be aware of things like the parental sorting that I mentioned, and I'll show you an example of that. And if you do not have Pro Tools, this was one of the happiest days I can remember in recent memory. I made memes, take my money, please. Like, I need these Pro Tools. It's very important. If you are dealing with endogamy in particular, you need Pro Tools. Just that is what you need at this time. So let's talk about Ancestry DNA and endogamy. I remember when the longest segment became available. That was another wonderful day, okay? We need that because there's still no chromosome browser, so I can't see how large segments are or on the flip side, how small they are, right? Because I like to get rid of the small segments when I'm doing my totals. But knowing the longest segment, and hopefully Ancestry, if you hear me, please let us sort by longest segment. That would be great. This is very important for us. And you may be familiar with the Timber algorithm. So the Timber algorithm, people sometimes get confused how it works. It basically tries to strip, what they would say are identical by state or population segments at a certain point, but it doesn't kick in until 90 centimorgans. So anything above that, when you might have seen those weighted or unweighted totals, that's what that's talking about. So above 90, the weighted and unweighted are the same because Timber hasn't taken effect, but below that, you'll see where it's kind of, saying that this is an archaic segment and it's not really useful for matching. But I find it can be pretty useful when dealing with endogamy because it tends to strip some of those segments, at least for me, that seem to be older and based on the fact that I'm from a very small community. And yeah, as I said there, so look at those weighted versus unweighted totals. Okay, this is a big one. This DNA match is appearing on my through lines. We must share DNA through the ancestor. So I want to be very, very clear with you. Through lines is based on trees. They're looking at trees. If they see you share DNA with somebody and you may match them in their tree, maybe you're genealogical ancestors with them. But third cousins don't have to share DNA 10% of the time. Fourth cousins, 50% of the time. That still applies to endogamous populations. What just ends up happening is we have matches with fourth and fifth cousins that we share some DNA with, but it might not be from the most recent common ancestor that you expect. So what happens a lot is people attribute, oh, I have a DNA match with this is my sixth cousin according to my tree. They may be your sixth cousin genealogically, but you may not be sharing DNA from that common ancestor. And I can't tell you enough with, there's mistakes in through lines. I got a lot of names like Klein and Cohen and whatever it is that are common. Maybe you have Smith or Jones or whatever it is. It might pick up the wrong one, okay? And assume that that's how you're related. So people, jump to conclusions there, and I want to caution you about that because, as I said, they rely on pre-existing family trees. So just really important, I'm going to show you an example of that as well shortly. So parent assignment on Ancestry. So here's a match that popped up for me. It says the second cousin wants removed, and it said it's on my maternal side. 127 centimorgans, they have a private tree, they think there's a common ancestor there. Okay, this is what the common ancestor, Etta. This is what they decided made it this side of the family. But what's interesting is it doesn't actually match what's going on here, and it's not a maternal side match. It is a paternal side match, and it gets really angry in red when you change it. Okay? They don't like that, but I know who this person is, and they're a paternal match. And I'm fortunate enough to have both my parents test, so they both share DNA with this person. And I can't look at the segments to see what's going on here, but I get the angry red color. So what I'm trying to show you here is that you may have mislabeled matches. Even the parent 1, parent 2. They don't know completely if you're dealing with an endogamous population. So expect some angry red when you make changes. So here's an example of when Timber kicks in, but also what I'm looking for. So often, we talk about 100 centimorgans plus, but I commonly look at matches way less than that in totals because I like the segments. So this is actually a known match to me. It's 52 centimorgans across 3 segments, and that is the after Timber. So it was originally 69. But the longest segment's 46. This is the kind of match I like, right? It's a nice long segment, not a lot of segments. And I happen to know this person. I believe they're actually a third cousin once removed, so there's obviously maybe one of those segments is archaic and being inflated a little bit. But this is a real match to me. And again, that's why I would love eventually to have longest segments, to resort, because you have to dig a little bit to get down to this. I happened to search by surname so I could find it, but when you have 200,000 matches, it can take some time. So this is what I'm doing here when I'm looking at segments. So on Ancestry, here's a match that says it's on my father's side. 93 centimorgans across 11 segments. I already want you to do the math in your head, 93 divided by 11. Those are going to be some tiny segments probably, right? So when I click on it, I find that the longest segment is 15. That's already a red flag that this is probably not a great match. And remember, they told me it's on my father's side, and this is how much my father shares with this match. Okay, so my father shares 32 across 7. It went through timber. It was originally 57, but the longest segment's 12. So who knows what happened there. But what I'm trying to get across is I have a lot of matches like this, like probably 199,900, okay? And it's helpful for me because both my parents tested, so I can compare, but if I didn't have them, I just had to look at that longest segment and know that that's likely problematic. And as I said, Pro Tools is a must. It is a game changer because what happens is when everyone's sharing with each other, when it was just shared matches, you couldn't really tell which bucket everyone belonged in. But now, I have this match here, and it's telling me that, this M figure is, Jeffrey is the nephew of the M figure, right? So and those are some good shares that they have, or whatever it is, but it tells me how other people are sharing. So when I told you to target test people, so for me, I have tons of people on each cluster. If I look at shared matches for an unknown match and I see that all those people I tested are matching this unknown person, that can be really helpful to me. Okay, 23andMe. So still, my chromosome browser is disabled. I am sad because I very much love the chromosome browser at 23andMe, and that includes the advanced DNA comparison, which was an amazing, amazing tool dealing with endogamy. So I'm not going to go deep into it today, but know if it comes back, you need it in your life. Most matches are going to say both sides again. Predictions by the company are way off, especially for endogamous populations, so focus on centimorgans. Always be wary of the family tree function. And this is a place, though, you can resort by number of segments that can be very helpful to you. So I can resort, and then I can go to the last page and see the least number of segments. But also be mindful of haplogroups. Why do I say that? We'll talk about it. So the first thing you want to do whenever you're looking at a match, you need to view the relatives in common. So Ancestry, I showed you, just did that with Pro Tools. 23andMe was doing it before, because it helps me see how everyone, when they used to say both sides for every single match I had, except for maybe 3. But when I see, how mom or dad, it can be very, very helpful for understanding where does that match belong. So they took this away for a while, and then they brought it back, and so that made me happy. And I'll talk about haplogroups here. I took out some of the slides because they don't have a chromosome browser, but when you're dealing with endogamous populations, it's not uncommon for lots of people to have the same haplogroups. Ashkenazi Jews, for example, 40% of them have the same 4 maternal haplogroups. Okay, I have one of them, N1B2. Lots of others have that as well. So, if people followed haplogroups all the time, you would think you were trying to find how my maternal grandfather is connected to my father because they have the same maternal haplogroup. Okay, and that's just a product of being from an endogamous population. It can be also the same for Y haplogroups, although, if it's a more rare one, again, we don't throw out the tools that are offered to us, but you just have to be mindful that it could just be a product of endogamy. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. MyHeritage, so it's an Israeli company that's popular among Europeans. So if you have, from an endogamous group that's around the world, definitely at least upload here. They have a lot of the features of both. Trees, how many centimorgan matches that share with the other matches in common. They have a chromosome browser that does that triangulation for you. So what's triangulation? So say, you have A is B and B is C, but is A is equals C? We want to see that. But a lot of times with endogamous populations, right? So maybe that segment you might share with this person, and that person shares with that person, but maybe it's on a maternal chromosome versus a paternal chromosome, right? So they do the work for you, but we use triangulation often to determine, if we all share a common ancestor. We want to all share in the same place, so you have to check that. You can't just make assumptions. They have auto-clustering, which I'll talk about as well. So here is a known match to me. She was a surprise second cousin once removed. I have a lot of surprises. And, MyHeritage hits it here. So we have, it was a 167 centimorgan match, longest about 40 centimorgans over 10 segments. Okay, pretty good, right? Kind of fits what I told you for what we're looking for. And just so you see on that far right, that symbol means there's triangulation there, which there should be because I'm just showing you between my mother and with Donna's daughter. So we would hope there's triangulation because we inherit segments from our parents. And then when you look at it at the chromosome browser, they highlight exactly where you're sharing. So they're kind of checking for you to make sure that everybody's sharing in the same place, which is very nice and helpful when you're trying to determine if everyone likely comes from the same most recent common ancestor. However, there's something you also have to pay attention to with MyHeritage, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit. So this gentleman, Mr. Simon, reached out to me, and he said, hey, I see you're a match to me. How are we related? And look at it, 123 centimorgans over 9, longest 37 centimorgans. Pretty good, right? We like that? As I told you, both my parents have tested on all the sites as well. Neither of my parents match Mr. Simon. What's happening here? We're going to talk about that. I want you to keep that in your mind, okay? I'm going to show you what's happening shortly. And then if I try to do an auto-cluster, and MyHeritage does adjust for endogamy, they lift the minimum threshold to 95 centimorgans, usually it's at 90. You have all these clusters, but here's the problem here. Most of these matches aren't real. So I'm getting a bunch of clusters of matches that I'm not actually connected to. I think that first cluster, which I already know, that big one, cluster 1, is the only one that's legitimate. So clustering doesn't work great for endogamous populations. I would love for it to, but again, Mr. Simon is part of this cluster for me. But if he's not a real match, that's a problem. Okay, so if you've been doing auto-clustering, even though it's not a giant brick, right, it still doesn't work necessarily. Okay, remember what I said because I'm going to show you family tree DNA, and then we're going to talk about it. Family tree DNA can be great because you can sort by segment length. They allow you to do that as one of your filters. And for a while, I remember when they lifted their threshold, they used to include really teeny tiny segments that basically all the matches were, you couldn't use them, but then they fixed that. The chromosome browser is still a necessity. Now, let's talk about why in mtDNA, because people tend to think that, that kind of cuts through endogamy. And it's true, the DNA itself isn't affected by endogamy, right? Because you're not getting all these autosomal, mom and dad kind of confounding things for you. You're just getting a pure matrilineal line and a pure patrilineal line, right? But the problem is, also it can rule out possibilities. I'm not going to discount it, but it's heavily population dependent, its effectiveness. So, for example, it's going to depend a lot on the history. When were surnames starting in your population? Are they going back hundreds and hundreds of years or just maybe 100 or 2? That's going to make a difference. Are the records available? How far can you build your trees back? And so I say this also because, colonial. I like building colonial trees. They're fun. I can take them back, people 10, 11 generations. Looks really different than Ashkenazi Jews who can maybe go to the 1800s if we're lucky. Surnames were only adopted around then. If you take a Y-DNA test, most Ashkenazi Jews, completely different surnames. And as I said, 40% of Ashkenazi Jews have the same 4 maternal haplogroups. It's not super useful. But again, something like colonial, French-Canadian, where your trees go back really, really far, you could make heads or tails of things. So I don't want to rule it out, but endogamy affects it in that way because of just the population. So just something to think about. Now, when we're talking about family tree DNA, again, I'm showing you the filter here, you're going to resort by longest block. And you're going to do that because a lot of times, lots of small segments are, again, going to make your totals look very high, and your top matches could be totally not useful to you. So I always do this first. And what I love about family tree DNA is I can look at my chromosomes, and I can kind of count, how big the segments are. These are segments above 6 centimorgans. And I put this in, I'm comparing with a known second cousin to me, Sharon, and how this all looks. But why I'm showing you this also is even when my second cousin Sharon, who I know is a relative to me, we still have teeny tiny segments that might be inflating our totals. So if you can see what's highlighted there, that is a 6.79 centimorgan segment. I don't like that. So I'm going to delete it if I'm going to chromosome paint or I want to get a more true total. Most of the time we're told, you want to focus on matches of 7 centimorgans or above. For endogamous populations, I tend to say at least 10, could be up to more than 15, okay? You might want to focus on segments that are greater than 15. It depends on your population and what you're seeing in your matches. I also like to resort a lot of time. As I said, the default is 6 centimorgans plus. I like to make it 10, just make my life easier, because I don't like any segments under 10, because they're more likely to be a factor that I'm from an endogamous population. So let the program do the work for you. And again, I'm showing you the detailed segment data. It's showing me the length of all the segments I share with Sharon. And you can see there's quite a few under 10. And I would have to do a lot more investigation to determine if the ones between 7 and 10 are, because we share our known most recent common ancestors, or because it's coming from a totally different source. The ones I feel good about are the one that's 16 centimorgans, the one that's 22, the one that's 12 probably, the one that's almost 15, right? Those are the ones I feel better about. But why I like chromosome browsers, because you can just kind of see it in action, right? You can see how this could get very convoluted if, there are matches that are much less. I don't know how they are. Maybe it's a 100 centimorgan match, but all the segments are teeny tiny, 10, 11, things like that. So you can see why this is really important. Now, let's go back to MyHeritage and the gasps we had when I showed this. So this was a surprise match. And this is a reminder why you need to be at every company. This is my mother's test to a gentleman named Grigory. Look at that longest segment. 108 centimorgan length segment when your total is 263. This is an unknown match. We suspect it's a second cousin. He was surprised 50% Jewish in Latvia, so we have a sense of where it might be coming from. We're still kind of teasing it out. But I was quite struck by that 108 centimorgan longest segment. So, we talked about a lot of things. I told them, why don't you upload to Family Tree DNA? But before that, let's just kind of look at it. It's legitimate. It's on chromosome 11. It's big. I like those segments. But here's what happened on Family Tree DNA. 3 segments now. Still quite large, some of them, but not 100 centimorgans. Here's an extreme example. What happens with MyHeritage's algorithm sometimes is they lace tiny segments together in their imputation, or I'm not totally aware of how their algorithm works with things, but they lace segments that are close to each other, and they have really, really large segments because of it. So often people come to me and say, I have this huge segment on MyHeritage, but I can't make heads or tails of where it's coming from. That could be why, because they're making these pseudo segments that are quite long. And this is an extreme example, and this is still a real match, but think about Mr. Simon. They must have seen some small segments next to each other, especially for that long 35 plus 36 centimorgan, and laced them together because my mother and father didn't share with him. They didn't show up as a match. Okay, so again, I like to show the extreme example because then you can kind of whittle it down to that smaller one. But that's what happens with a lot of our matches. So it's just a really important point. Okay, a quick word about GEDmatch. I find that not as many people use it anymore unless they're in the IgG, the Investigative Genetic Genealogy community, so I still hang out here. But there is, especially if you're not having a chromosome browser, it can be really helpful to have people upload here and look at it. So, this is how it works. This is the classic view, I believe. You still look at the one-to-many matches. In the newer view, you can resort by largest segment. Again, I'm here multiple times, don't ask me why, but there's a known first cousin once removed there. The largest segment is 52. Actually, these are for my mother. So it's our first cousin, the longest is 52. That first cousin wants to remove Sharon that I showed you in FTDNA. You know, they all share depending on the company. And then there is a match down there that has like a nice little segment of 28, Nina, the second to last one. That's a real match, but I only knew it really because the surname was the same. But it's really important to kind of resort because all of a sudden, you know, that Tilly, it kind of looked like an okay match with 98 centimorgans, but the largest segment is 13. And she's one of the higher matches. Long time ago, not as much anymore as I've tested more people for my mother on Ancestry, and I always tried to wonder, like, where does she come from? So it's really important to do that. And now a word about this. So are your parents related tool? I often see people who aren't sure if they're dealing with endogamy be told, run your DNA through the Are Your Parents Related tool on GEDmatch to see if you're dealing with endogamy. This is my result, okay? So I have one segment that's about 8.5 centimorgans that suggests that my parents are distantly related. Duh, okay? I'm from an endogamous population, so that's not surprising to me. What if I had 0 here? I'm still from an endogamous population. Whether or not this is happening doesn't have any bearing on how much endogamy I'm dealing with. If you're dealing with endogamy, you're dealing with endogamy. The only thing that's going to look different is I deal with 100% endogamy. You know, my uncle deals with 50% because he's only 50% Ashkenazi Jewish. Okay? That's the only thing that makes a difference. Whether or not somebody has a positive result here, this is meant to check runs of homozygosity for, you know, more recent relationships. Okay? You know, if your parents were second cousins or something like that. Okay? It's not meant to see if you're dealing with an endogamous population because it's not helpful in that manner, and it's not supposed to be used in that manner. So just kind of a, you know, I see it all the time and I don't understand it, so I just want to talk about it. Okay. So one of the last things that I want to talk about here, and let me just make sure I have this here. Okay, so DNA Painter, and I quite love DNA Painter. If you're not painting your chromosomes, you're missing out. This is kind of where I am at with my genome. I'm sad because another match showed up on 23andMe and I can't paint it because there's no chromosome browser. But it's really, really helpful to kind of visualize what you're dealing with in your tree. So let's see if I actually painted this. Yeah. So here is an example that I want to show. There's actually 2 examples here that I want to talk about. So hopefully you can see on chromosome 2, it's kind of, and I'm horrible with colors, but there's kind of a fuchsia line with a little yellow segment on top. I hope everyone can kind of see that on the bottom chromosome 2. The yellow is on top. What does this mean? So that fuchsia is connected to my maternal, fuchsia is connected to my maternal grandfather's side, okay? Maternal grandfather. The yellow is connected to my maternal grandmother's side, right? So that yellow match is somebody that I know on my mother's my mother's mother's side, while the fuchsia is a closer cousin on my mother's father's side. That is endogamy. That little yellow segment is about 13 centimorgans long. So when I was telling you that I'm very cautious of segment, I always paint segments between 10 and 15 centimorgans. Yes. But I do it but being aware that anything between 10 and 15 could be an endogamous segment. And you can see that fuchsia one is much longer, so it's more likely to come from a more recent common ancestor, while that yellow one is more archaic. Because I can't inherit in the same spot from both my maternal grandmother and my maternal grandfather, correct? That doesn't work like that. So the yellow one, I just keep it there to show all of you what endogamy looks like. But you could delete that segment knowing that that is an endogamous segment. Okay, so the last thing I want to kind of talk about with DNA Painter here, and let's see if yeah, there's that segment there. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about was I had a gentleman reach out to me on Ancestry. We shared like nothing. Like it was a real, you know, I get matches messaging me all the time, and they'd say, you know, I'm from this line, how are we related? Okay, so this one, he messaged me, and he said, I think we're related on our Rifkin lines. And Rifkin, you might not be familiar, it's not the most common name, but it's not uncommon either. And I said, okay, you know, whatever you say. It was small match. I didn't think much of it, but I always check. I do my due diligence. So the first thing I did was I checked him against my mother, because my mother, that's her Rifkin line. And he shared a little more with her. I said, okay, can't throw it out yet. Because, usually what happens, mom will share less and dad will share some, and that's the end of it. But no, my mother shared a little more. So then I looked for my mother's account, and I clicked shared matches. And lo and behold, all the shared matches were connected to people that would be Rifkins. I said, okay. All right, let's do this. So I started, painting a little bit of all those matches. And I saw on chromosome 6, they're very small segments, and I wouldn't want to write any sort of peer-reviewed paper, saying this has to be why. But these matches shared here, which suggested triangulation from a most recent common ancestor. What's more important is I started building trees. And I looked at this gentleman's tree and all the matches we had in common, and it suggested that, yeah, we do share a Rifkin ancestor, and it might have broken a brick wall. I think that this man and I might be something like third cousins once removed or fourth cousins. And it took me back to my second great-grandmother's father. We think that we share that same third great-grandfather or something like that there. Again, it's a hypothesis. I'm still kind of working toward it. These aren't huge segments. I'd like to test more people from this line to see what I see. But again, these are small matches. This is endogamy, but I'm still doing all the things I'm supposed to do to find new branches in my tree. So I want to give the sense that not all hope is lost, because people panic a lot of the time that they can't use these tools. I use these tools. I make modifications. Like I recognize that I have to use bigger segments. But if I test more and more people, I get way more data, and I can say with more fidelity that I'm on the right track. So I recognize there's probably going to be a lot of questions, so I ended a little bit earlier than I typically do with this talk. But if you have any questions for me, 1 minute when you can come up here. I'm on social media regularly. I engage in a lot of the DNA groups, which is how I learn a lot of what I know about endogamy. So if you're not on social media, that's my plug to you. Please get in groups like DNA Detectives, Genetic Genealogy Tips and Tricks, or Tips and Techniques. I don't know, I always say GGTT, that's how I remember it. But get in these groups and pay attention, because that is how you're going to learn things and practice as well. So now I'm happy to answer any questions for you if you want to line up here and speak into the microphone.
Yeah, why is it possible that siblings have 2 or 3% different on different origins? And also, my first test was with MyHeritage, and it said I was mostly from Greece and southern Italy, but when I did the ancestry, it said I was 36% Welsh. And that really puzzled me until I found out that there were Roman soldiers in what is now Wales.
So that really doesn't pertain to endogamy so much. That just has to do with ethnicity estimates, and you don't inherit the same as your siblings. You get a different 50% from each of your parents unless you're all identical to each other. And even then, depending on what day you test, it could look different. I would suggest reading the white papers for all those sites to understand why the ethnicity estimates look like they do. But, and also MyHeritage just came out with an update version 2.5 for ethnicity estimates, so I'd be curious if you have a very different result than you did before, and maybe it looks more closely related to what it is on the other sites. Yes?
So, forgive me for a very basic question,
That's
but
fine.
maybe somebody else is wondering this. I thought I kind of understood this. How is it possible that you had this pretty large match to this fellow and neither of your parents did when you inherit 50% of your DNA from each of your parents?
Okay, because what's likely happening is that imputation. So there are probably a lot of small segments that weren't showing up for my parents because they're so small, but when they were next to each other, they were laced together to make bigger segments.
I see, the imputation.
Exactly, the imputation. So that's what I'm trying to tell everybody. And again, I'm very fortunate I have my parents. A lot of people don't have that. But if you're seeing things like that and it's not making sense, if you can get them to another chromosome browser if possible and do what I did, I took that 100 centimorgan segment and then I put it on Family Tree DNA and it became 3 segments. Still quite sizable, but not the same thing. Yep. More questions? Yes.
Leah Larkin's done some work for a given DNA match to categorize whether it comes from an endogamous population or not. Have you worked with that type of data as well?
So she tends to do the ratios. So if you divide and it's something like 12 or 13 centimorgans average or higher, it might be worth looking at. But again, it's going to depend on your population that you're dealing with. 13, 14, I'm going to look at it for sure. So I like 100 centimorgans divided by 3 as opposed to 100 centimorgans divided by 9, right? Because think about the segment sizes that are likely to be there. And that's the kind of tools we have to use for Ancestry. I think that's what you were talking about with kind of how she navigates. She also, works a lot with, I think, Akkadian DNA, which can be very similar, but they also have much better trees in some ways as well. So, yeah, do you have a question?
Yeah, I've been struggling with my family because there's a lot of endogamy, and my background would be French Canadian, Acadian, some Jewish, Spanish, Iberian, I guess you call it. So when I look at my matches in Ancestry, I was struggling with knowing if I'm looking for somebody on my father's side, do I still look at my identified parent 1, because every single name I have applies to both sides of my family.
So, yes, that's where it gets difficult because you can't, sometimes it's unassigned, which I think makes it a lot easier. I wish they wouldn't assign it sometimes.
Yeah.
But really, all you can do is if you test a lot of people on either side and see how the shared matches kind of play out, you have a better sense of where that match belongs. But I really want to stress you cannot follow parent 1 and parent 2 with fidelity. It doesn't work for us. It makes a lot of people confused. I see messages all the time. I know this person's on my mom's side, but it's saying my dad's side. And I just showed you, Ancestry's going to get mad. It's going to warn you. It says, are you sure? And I was sure. Okay, but a lot of people don't, they're not professional genetic genealogists, and it makes them, they don't like it. So that's all I can say for you. You just have to know that it doesn't work for you in the same way. Same thing with kind of the chromosome painting. Sometimes we've been seeing that they assign the ethnicity to the wrong parent as well, if it's a smaller amount. I mean, it doesn't happen for me because I'm 99% Ashkenazi Jewish now in Ancestry, that 1% Netherlands, that'll be gone. But, you just have to be mindful that you have to do a little bit more work.
Yeah, I think I wasted a lot.
I call it being thrown into the deep end of the pool if you're dealing with endogamy. You don't get to kind of do the doggy paddle and learn all the things. You have to be thrown in and sink or swim. Okay. Yeah, sorry. Any other questions? Yes.
Curious to know, how does it get?
Can you speak into the mic, please, so they can?
How does it get into the unassigned group?
I mean, if it's in the unassigned group, maybe I'd have to probably read better what the white paper says, but it probably can't really determine if it's maternal or paternal based on the segments because you probably share with both sides and it doesn't want to make a call. That's really what it is. And again, I wish they would do that because it would make my life a lot easier. And a lot of times, they even do it for really close matches a lot. They say unassigned because you must share, I showed you Sharon, or I showed you a match where I was getting a segment from one person on my maternal grandmother's side versus my maternal grandfather. That happens. You will still share segments that aren't real with known matches. That's going to happen. That's why it's really helpful to know the size of the segments. Yes?
So I'm working a lot with small communities in County Kerry, Ireland, and there was a famous headline in the Kerryman newspaper years ago that heart disease is really bad in County Kerry because we are so closely bred. But maybe I'm not seeing it. I haven't seen any endogamy. How do I know that I'm not dealing with it, I guess?
That's a good question because, as I said, endogamy is kind of a continuum. So maybe if you're confused whether you're seeing it or not, maybe it's not really big in the population. It is an island population, so it wouldn't surprise me if there's endogamy going on because you're kind of limited in your options. But the best way to tell is, are your matches saying, unassigned, or are you seeing both sides for things? When you click shared matches, do known maternal matches share with, paternal matches that you know? That's the best way to kind of determine that. And again, I have a lot of matches, but there's some populations that don't test as much. so I see that too. But, that's a good test, and you could try the clusters as well to see if you get a nice big block or something like that, if everybody's sharing with each other.
Also, another very basic question.
Yes.
I have Ancestry Pro Tools, and I find it very useful. How do I know if what advice do you have for actually using Pro Tools?
So the Pro Tools, I mostly use it for that shared match feature. And it can be great for everybody, because what if that match doesn't respond to you, but you click shared matches and you see that you also share with their aunt and they have a tree and you can do all the things that you didn't know you could do before. It's wonderful. I will also say that I got a message today about a new tool at Ancestry that remains to be seen if it'll be helpful or not for endogamous populations. I don't want to talk about it yet because I just saw it in one of the social media groups, but it's related to kind of something that I alluded to that's done in other sites, so we'll see. But yeah, yes,
If you don't,
yes.
if you don't have the benefit of having both your parents
Yep.
tested, how do you rule imputation in or out?
So it's a
What would
really
be your
good,
technique?
it's a good question. I show my parents just because I want to show you exactly what's happening. What I would do if you don't have parents in general with all of this is test other close relatives. So maybe you have first cousins who can test or second cousins, things like that. Because, if I didn't have my parents around, I could still probably figure out something's wrong because, maybe my second cousins, my first cousins probably don't share well with Mr. Simon as well, right? But that's why, especially when you're dealing with endogamous populations, you have to target test people. You have to, nobody said genealogy was a cheap hobby, right? Take advantage of all the sales during Roots Tech, please. I am on all the sites. I have unique matches on all the sites, okay? So don't think one's necessarily better than the other. And I hope today you kind of noticed how I work through endogamy because, I'm living proof. I have scores of matches that I didn't know. I've opened up new lines. I've helped countless people who are dealing with endogamy, so it can all be done. So I want to make people feel kind of empowered with what they're doing, but also not spinning their wheels looking at matches that don't matter. Okay? So any other questions? Okay, another question. See, I ended a little early. I thought there'd be lots of questions for this one. Okay, yes.
Sorry to monopolize, but
It's
since
okay.
nobody else is up here, I do have one more question.
Yeah.
I work for someone who's 100% Ashkenazi,
Yeah.
helping him with his tree. So he has tons and tons of both sides
Yeah.
matches. So would your recommendation for that, I assume, be just to do genealogy to figure out where they fit?
So with
or is there a
Ashkenazi,
better?
you have to build the trees
Right.
because, surname, we don't know, most Jews do not know past their grandparents, their great-grandparents, and they might not know a maiden name, and it might just say Russia or Hungary or whatever, okay? So you have to build the trees. Also, if there's known relatives, say, hey, second cousin, test, because again, it really helps put people in the buckets, and you have to have Pro Tools so you can see, because I have matches I couldn't figure out, but then Pro Tools came and I saw that it was that person's sister. I saw it was that person's cousin, and it was a game changer, because what would happen is, on these sites, you'd have share matches, but then you might see that, the expected person only shared like 12 centimorgans with them. So it's still showing up as a match and a shared match, but it wasn't legitimate. So you want people who share in a similar category as you, so absolutely.
Great, thanks.
Yep, yes.
So I uploaded my DNA to MyHeritage. And yeah, I did the auto cluster thing, which is kind of cool. But ultimately, I found it useless because almost none of the people had built family trees. So am I missing something?
No, that's kind of what it means to be a genealogist. I do the work for most of the people. Often, I don't know what about you, but a lot of times I might take screenshots, whatever, reach out to the person, but then I figure out everything about their tree and more than they ever knew, and then when they get back to me, and then I have to pretend like I didn't really know anything, and so not to make it really awkward. Welcome to genealogy, that's the best I can say, but that's what we do. We build trees all the time, and I think a lot of people whose entry point into this world who was DNA, there's different buckets. There's the people who were genealogists and then they added DNA to their repertoire. And then there are people who took their first DNA test and were enamored, but then had to learn genealogy. So, and it's different skill sets. So you really have to tree build. There's no substitute. And that's why I start this whole presentation with DNA is not a silver bullet, which people hate to hear, but it's the truth. It's just another part of our toolbox. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I suspected that I came from an endogamous
Yes.
population,
five
but
times
and
fast,
that's
yes.
why I came to this talk. And
Yeah.
so I'm kind of new to it, but I definitely feel that now that, both of my father's parents came from a small town in Asia Minor. They were Greeks.
Okay,
And
yeah.
they were, driven out in
Yep.
the early 20th century.
Yep.
And so I started with DNA too, and I found all these DNA relatives that can somehow trace their roots back to that small town. So, but most of your talk was over my head, and I'm just wondering, what's the best
Well,
way
the
to
best way, first of
start?
all, it's recorded, so you can watch it again. I
I
definitely.
mean, your terms and like a lot of.
Yeah, I mean,
throughout,
this is not a basic talk. I mean, this is a more advanced. I think definitely look for, endogamy is a new term to lots of people, but, find basic talks that mention what centimorgans are and kind of navigate how to go through all the sites in the first place. And really, there's no substitute for just kind of getting your hands dirty yourself and digging in. But there's plenty of talks going on here that are more basic in nature. This one is definitely more advanced because, a lot of people get stymied very quickly with this. But I hope, eventually you come back to it and it's kind of more of an aha moment. But yeah, it's
Yeah, I think
not easy.
it could be really useful because all the people I talk to who we share DNA and we know we're from this town, but we have no idea
Right,
who our
right.
common ancestor is. So this is great. Thank you.
Okay, this is going to be the last question because we're out of time.
Fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. I noticed that you showed some auto-cluster pages, one of yours that was just covered, and then the
Yeah.
other one was lots of tiny, tiny little
Yeah.
boxes, and you said that one was unhelpful. Can you review exactly why?
Yeah, so the big first one was just kind of, they took all the matches and everybody was a shared match with each other, and that was a big block. The one on MyHeritage tries to account for endogamy and making these smaller clusters, but the problem is that most of those matches are what we call pseudo-matches. They're not real, right? They might have these inflated segments and they're in no way traceable. So I should not waste my time trying to figure out how I'm related to them because I'm not related to them in a meaningful way. I'm just related to them because we're all identical by state or population, whatever you want to call it. That's really what I meant by that. Even though the clusters are very nice and those people likely share with each other, they could be dealing with the same phenomenon. And a lot of those clusters I found when I looked at them, it was like two brothers of each other in there, or like a brother and like they were known to each other and they just kind of popped the cluster for me. All right, so that's kind of all the time we have. Please don't forget to go to the app and provide feedback. Again, you can reach me on social media. I have a lot of questions I have to answer, but really just get your hands dirty, dig in, paint, see what's happening, okay? So thank you.